Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join tonight's webinar on the new AP Statistics course and the practice of statistics, what you need to know, presented by leading statistics authors and experienced AP teachers, Daren Starnes and Josh Tabor. I'm your host, or MC, so to speak. My name is Thomas Mena, and I am the STEM Marketing Manager here at BFW High School Publishers. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly go over some things, as well as take a moment to introduce Daren and Josh. Here you will see an agenda for tonight's program. The bulk of the webinar will be Daren and Josh's presentation, followed by a Q&A. We hope to wrap things up around 7:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Some other quick notes. There are many attendees, so everyone is muted and will be muted throughout the webinar. We will be emailing a follow-up to this webinar with its recording along with other info we go over. So don't worry if you miss something or need to step away for a moment. Please allow a couple of days or so for us to send it out, but be sure to check your spam folders if you don't see it after a few days. For questions, and this is very important for the Q&A section of the webinar, you should see a chat function on your GoToWebinar toolbar. In the chat function, choose the option Send Question to Staff. This way, the questions will get sent to me in a special question box so I can read them out loud for Daren and Josh to answer during the Q&A section. And in some cases, I can answer them myself through text. Feel free to send questions in at any time during the webinar. Since there are many attendees, it is possible we may not get to all of the questions during the Q&A. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We will do our best to address anything that goes unanswered in our follow-up. However, feel free to send any unanswered questions directly to hsmarketing@bfwpub.com, and we'll try to reply to them as quickly as we can. For sales-related questions, things like price quotes, ordering information, digital options, and pricing, feel free to contact your sales rep. Your webinar invite should have come from your sales rep. However, if you're unsure who they are, you can email hsmarketing@bfwpub.com as well, and we can let you know. Your rep is a resource for you and is always happy to talk to you about our books as well as share info, whether you're a current user or not, and even if you're not purchasing books anytime soon, they're there to help you. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed presenters this evening, who many of you in the AP statistics community, I'm sure, are already familiar with. Along with being the authors of the Practice of Statistics series, both Daren and Josh have such impressive resumes and backgrounds. I thought I'd highlight a little bit about them each right here. Daren Starnes is Mathematics Department Chair and holds the Robert S. and Christina Sykes Dow Distinguished Master Teacher Chair in Mathematics at the Lawrenceville School near Princeton, New Jersey, where I'll have you know tonight there is a tornado warning, so apologies if you hear sirens or anything going on like that. A frequent speaker at local, national, and international conferences, Daren has led numerous one-day, week-long AP Statistics Institutes for new and experienced teachers, and has been a reader, table leader, and question leader for the AP Stats exam since 1998. Daren is also, along with Josh, the co-author of the popular on-level stats book, Statistics and Probability with Applications. Josh Tabor has enjoyed teaching on-level and AP stats to high school students for more than 23 years. Each year, like Daren, Josh leads AP Summer Institutes and College Board workshops around the world and frequently speaks to local, national, and international conferences. In 2011, he was a top 5 finalist for Arizona Teacher of the Year, and he has been a reader, table leader, and question leader for the AP Statistics exam since 1999. And was a past member of the AP Statistics Development Committee from 2005 to 2009, as well as in 2013 named to the SAT Mathematics Development Committee. He is co-author of the Statistics and Probability with Applications textbook with Daren, as well as the on-level stats textbook, Statistical Reasoning in Sports. With that, Daren and Josh, allow me to say thank you in advance for not only your time and presentation tonight, but for everything you do for the AP and high school statistics community. If you're ready, I will pass this screen to you and allow you to take it from here.
Thanks, Tommy. As Tommy mentioned, we're just a few miles apart here in New Jersey, which apparently is the tornado belt today. I guess it's a break from all those tornadoes that have been hitting the middle of the country lately. So if we have any glitches in the transmission, we apologize ahead of time. We'll try to keep things going, though. As Tommy mentioned, we want to talk specifically about how you can use the practice of statistics with the College Board's new course and exam description. I'm hoping everybody is aware that there is a new course and exam description, and that maybe some of you have already looked at it. It is available now on the AP Central site for AP Statistics. But let's talk a little more specifically about this new course and exam description. If you haven't had a chance to peruse it, you'll find that it outlines in great detail the required content and skills for the AP Statistics course, including some specific learning objectives and essential knowledge statements. It also defines how the content will be assessed on the exam and discusses some course skills that students should develop during the AP Statistics course. Important to note that the new course framework is organized into 9 units, each of which is attached to personal progress checks that are formative assessments that you can provide to students. You also will want to know that starting with the 2020 exam, the free response questions will be defined by the skills they're assessing. So a little bit later, Josh will walk you through the new skills so you can get a little more familiar with those. The weighting, the timing, and the number of questions on the exam will not be changing. So that's good for those of us who've been teaching for a while and guiding our students about how the exam's structured. Applause from many of the longtime teachers. There is a new formula sheet, and it is an improvement. I think everyone's going to be fond of some of the new layout as well as some of the formulas that don't appear anymore. And important from College Board, there are some new resources and supports available for teachers and for students, one of which is a new AP question bank that includes questions from previous AP exams, along with some additional personal progress check items that are searchable and filterable based on the new Understanding by Design framework, so the content and skills that I was mentioning earlier. So as you're thinking about this new course framework and the practice of statistics, a couple of important considerations. The first is, are you satisfied with your students' AP scores? Now, I realize none of us is ever completely satisfied with how our students do, but in general, are you satisfied with their pattern of performance if you've been teaching the course for a few years? Second, are you confident in and comfortable with your current pacing and order of presentation? The reason for this will be extremely obvious when you take a look at the unit structure in a few minutes. And third, how might you use the College Board's new personal progress checks? They come in 2 different types. One is an end of unit formative assessment. That's a pre-built canned assessment students can take. And the other are as individual topic questions that you can intersperse throughout the units. So you might be thinking already about how you're going to use those. The good news is that whether you're a user of the 4th, 5th, or 6th edition of TPS, those editions all include the essential content and skills that are part of the new AP Statistics course framework. The College Board makes it clear that you have flexibility to organize the course the way you want to, but I think there's a caveat. Considering that the personal progress checks have been developed by unit, and also considering that the AP question bank includes questions that are searchable and filterable by topics within those units, you have to think carefully about how the new unit structure will impact your teaching and your students' learning. So enough vagary. Let's take a look at these units. As you can see, there are 9 titled units in the College Board's course framework. And on the right-hand column, we have the alignment to chapters in TPS 4, 5, and 6. So for example, Unit 1, which is titled Exploring One Variable Data, corresponds roughly to chapters 1 and 2 in all three of the TPS editions. Unit 2 on exploring two variable data includes all of Chapter 3 plus transforming to achieve linearity, which is in section 12.2 of all three editions. Unit 3 on collecting data matches up nicely with Chapter 4 in TPS. Unit 4 is a very large unit on probability, random variables, and probability distributions, which corresponds to Chapters 5 and 6 in TPS. Unit 5 on sampling distributions, which is always a very difficult one for students, has expanded to include sampling distributions for a difference in proportions and for difference in means. So it's Chapter 7 of TPS 4, 5, 6, plus small subsections of what's currently in Section 10.1 with proportions and Section 10.2 with means. Then we get into the inference part of the course. So the first 5 units, there are just minor tweaks that would be necessary using any of the three editions. But starting with the inference, things are organized very differently. So TPS was built around the old course description and topic outline, which grouped inference by type of procedure, confidence interval, or significance test. The new course framework groups things by what type of data you're doing inference about. So Unit 6 you'll see is inference for categorical data proportions. So this includes all inference procedures, confidence intervals, and tests for one proportion and for a difference of proportions. So in the TPS series, that includes these sections, 8.1, 8.2, 9.1, 9.2, and 10.1. As we move on, Unit 7 is about inference for quantitative data, means. So that's one sample, confidence intervals and tests about a mean, and 2 sample confidence intervals and tests about a mean, and the special case of paired data. So that would correspond to sections 8.3, 9.3, 10.2, and in the case of 6th edition, we added a separate section on paired data. Unit 8 is inference for categorical data. Again, this one is the chi-square unit, and that matches up very nicely with Chapter 11 in TPS. And the final unit, which is a small unit, is inference for quantitative data, slopes of regression lines. And that's section 12.1 in TPS 6. So this is the big picture view as you look down. We've also developed documents for each of the editions. So for the 4th and 5th editions, let me just pop this up and show you that for each of the units, we've shown that alignment, but we've added a column for specific recommendations. I'm not going to go through those here because we address them more specifically later in the presentation, but we want you to know that these documents have been prepared and we're going to show you where to find them at the end of the talk. For the 6th edition, we have a separate alignment document. Because the 6th edition was only written a short time ago, we're very keen to make sure that users of the 6th edition know exactly what's changed in just a little over a year's time since we finished this edition. So those documents will be available for you to peruse later. And my final slide here is to start to dig down into the unit level. We're going to look at each of those units in a little more detail and talk to you about what's new and different and how that relates to the practice of statistics. So Unit 1 is about exploring one variable data, which includes Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 in TPS 4, 5, or 6. What's new? Well, the course framework specifically mentions a mosaic plot, which is a segmented bar graph that has the special feature that the widths of the bars are proportional to the sizes of those groups. That's quite an interesting graph. And in fact, my students were making some of these graphs today in either Fathom or Jump. But if you haven't run into them before, it's just going to look like a modified version of a segmented bar graph with the bars perhaps having different widths. Also, the course framework uses some vocabulary that in the past may have appeared later in the course. For example, discrete versus continuous quantitative variables are introduced in Unit 1. We have in the past saved those until the random variables discussion. Descriptive statistics versus inferential statistics might have been something that you talked about at the beginning of your course with students, but it's specifically mentioned in the course framework, so you definitely want to talk about it now. The distinction between statistic and parameter is part of Unit 1, and fits nicely with a discussion of, say, X bar versus mu, or sample standard deviation S of X versus population standard deviation sigma. The terms unimodal or single peaked, bimodal or double peaked, and approximately uniform appear in the course framework in this unit, and an emphasis on being sure students can distinguish variance from standard deviation. We all know those are important distinctions, but sometimes the students don't pay close attention to it now. And when we get to random variables, being able to combine variances is a good thing, and not being able to combine standard deviations is always very disappointing for the students. As far as Chapter 2, for us, that's modeling distributions of data, where we'll cover things like percentiles and z-scores, and then we'll get into modeling distributions with density curves, like a normal density curve. So a couple things to note here. The course framework specifically defines the percentile in a distribution to be the percent of values that are less than or equal to a specific observation or a specific value in the distribution. And also the course framework uses the term empirical rule, which is a term I learned in undergraduate for 68, 95, 99.7 rule. You'll see at the bottom of each slide we have comments about the pacing recommendations. The teacher's edition that's annotated for TPS has these guiding numbers of days: 9 days for Chapter 1, 7 days for Chapter 2, if you're pacing your course at a 110-day schedule. And then finally, we mentioned when to use these personal progress checks. So for Unit 1, the right time to use the prepackaged personal progress check is after students complete Chapters 1 and 2. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
All right, so we're going to move on now to Unit 2. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Unit 2, I wanted to mention that we have created a series of handouts that you can use with students. They're intended to be student-facing. The first one would include mosaic plots. So that's not currently in the 4th, 5th, or 6th edition. So this handout you can use with students. It introduces them to mosaic plots, gives them a couple exercises to practice interpreting those. There's also an answer key for you to use when you are reviewing those questions with your students. All these handouts, and I'll try to mention as other handouts are available, but all these handouts are available on the main site for all of our update materials. You'll see that link on slide 19, but it's the basic We've Got You Covered website for VFW publishers. All right, so now on to Unit 2. Unit 2 is exploring two variable data, and two variable data includes both categorical and quantitative data in this unit. So we wanted to note that we've always covered bivariate categorical data in section 1.1. That's, two-way tables, segmented bar graphs, talking about association between variables. That is bivariate data, and it is in section 1.1. The rest of the Unit 2 about exploring two variable data is in Chapter 3, which is describing relationships. That's your basic, scatter plots, correlation, and all the least squares regression line stuff, plus section 12.2, transforming to achieve linearity. Some key terms that you want to include univariate and bivariate. These aren't really difficult terms, but I could imagine if a student had never seen univariate or bivariate before, and that term showed up on the AP exam, they might stress them out a little bit. So to make sure and include those terms when you're talking about the differences between, say, Unit 1 and Unit 2. Also, the curriculum framework, the course framework, pardon me, has changed, I wouldn't say changed, but maybe more specifically defined what an outlier is in regression. An outlier is one that has a big residual. So a point that is far away in the x direction and in the pattern of the rest of the values would not be considered an outlier according to the new course framework, but instead would be a point with high leverage. And so high leverage is a new term. And again, we have a handout that goes through in great detail, giving examples of the difference between high leverage points, outliers, and then what influence those types of points have. So those are additional terms you want to make sure and talk about and supplement if you're using the 4th, 5th, or 6th edition. Also, and this really applies to only 6th edition users, in 4th edition and 5th edition, our basic form for a regression line was y hat equals a plus bx. You'll be happy to know that that's what the new course framework also uses. 6th edition users, we finally gave in when we wrote the 6th edition and used the b sub 0 plus b sub 1 x format that had been on the formula sheet, only to find out that they've now switched back to our original notation of y hat equals a plus bx. I don't think this should be a problem for you and your students. It's already what your calculators use, and I'm sure that students will be happier to have a simpler notation. So the last piece of advice here to cover this unit is to move section 12.2 forward as a 3rd section in chapter 3. So as far as your pacing for chapter 3, the teacher's edition suggests 8 days for chapter 3, and we're suggesting an additional 2 days to cover section 12.2, making that a 10-day unit. And then at the end of chapter 3, plus section 12.2, students will be ready for personal progress check number 2. All right, let's move on to unit 3. So unit 3 is nice. It's called collecting data, and what we do in chapter 4. So there's a really good alignment between unit 3 and chapter 4 in TPS. There are a couple new things to include. One is systematic random sampling. There is one exercise in TPS that addresses systematic random sampling already, but we have created a handout that you could use with students that goes into a little bit more depth with an example about systematic random sampling and a couple of exercises. Also introduced are the terms homogeneous and heterogeneous. Those are used in the context of stratified sampling and cluster sampling. So you'll want to make sure that students are familiar with those terms because they certainly could be used on the AP exam moving forward. The third change in this unit is a distinction among observational studies of a prospective observational study and a retrospective observational study. It's not too hard to make this distinction with kids, but again, we've created a handout that you can use with students to supplement chapter 4 when you're talking about observational studies. And again, all those handouts are going to be available on the We've Got You Covered website. In fact, they're currently available there if you were to go check that out. So for pacing, we feel like the addition of systematic random sampling and prospective and retrospective observational studies doesn't really add any meaningful length to the chapter or the amount of time you'd need to spend on it. So we're sticking with the original 11 days. And then at the end of chapter 4, you can complete personal progress check number 3. Now, before we move on, well, that's okay, you can leave the slide there. But some teachers like to use the collecting data chapter first. And that is going to be my plan moving forward. I still like to teach the collecting data chapter first. The one downside then is I would have to use personal progress check number 3 first. And the way the personal progress checks were developed, I was one of the people that helped write some of the items. Our instructions were that you can use any material in that unit and any preceding units. So I'll be curious to see if that causes any trouble or not. And so, especially if you're a new teacher and you're planning to use the personal progress checks, I'd encourage you to go in order. That way there's no surprises. If you're a veteran teacher and you like doing things in a slightly different order, then understand that there might be a little bit of a risk if you're using the personal progress checks. All right, now moving on to unit number 4. As Daren mentioned, this is a really big unit. Probability, random variables, and probability distributions. That covers both chapters 5 and 6 in TPS. So that's a big chunk of material. So for chapter 5 specifically, some things to make note of is that the course framework uses the term random process instead of chance process. Also, they use the word trial, where we often would use the word repetition. There's a discussion of empirical probability, Also, use of the terms disjoint for mutually exclusive and joint probability for the probability of A and B. So make sure your students are familiar with that so they don't get intimidated by new terms on the AP exam. For chapter 6, there's an important distinction, or actually connection, I should say, between a probability distribution and a population distribution. The course framework uses the term parameter to describe the mean of a probability distribution and also the mean of a population distribution. So it's important that students understand why that term parameter is fair to use in both of those cases. There's also a brief mention of a cumulative probability distribution. That would be the kind of thing that you'd use if you were trying to find the median, say, of a discrete probability distribution. Or if you've looked at question 6 on this year's exam, if you're trying to find the 5th and 95th percentile of a distribution, given the frequencies, you might consider constructing a cumulative probability distribution. Also, an emphasis on the difference between linear transformation and linear combinations, which are things that we cover in section 6.2 and all of the additions. There's also an increased emphasis on the 10% condition and independent observations within a sample. It's going to come up for the first time in chapter 6 when you're talking about binomial distributions, but it's going to really be emphasized a lot in chapter 7 on sampling distributions and later on in inference. Okay. And finally, probably the biggest change in this set of 2 chapters is an increased coverage of the geometric distribution, including not only the shape, but the center and the variability. So if you've looked at the formula sheet, you know that not only is the formula for geometric probabilities included, but also the mean of a geometric distribution and the standard deviation of a geometric distribution, which is certainly new since the previous formula sheet. So again, we've created a handout that you can use with students that covers this important information about geometric distributions. So make sure and check that out and plan on using that with your students. For pacing, we again suggest 8 days for chapter 5 and 9 days for chapter 6. Even with the additional requirement to cover the mean and standard deviation of a geometric distribution, we don't think that that should add enough material to warrant an additional day. Finally, you can use personal progress check number 4 after you complete chapters 5 and 6. All right. As we're getting ready to talk about Unit 5, I made a note to myself to mention when talking about the new formula sheet, one of the other things that we have on the We've Got You Covered website is sort of an annotated version of the formula sheet. So it covers 2 pages, which is what the formula sheet does, but we have lots of comments about how the formulas are either similar or different and how a user of TPS 4, 5, or 6 might need to make adjustments. So again, that document about the formula sheet is in the same place as all these other handouts that I've been mentioning. All right, Unit 5 on sampling distributions. One thing that was interesting to note as we were looking through the course framework is that they pushed off continuous random variables from Unit 4 into Unit 5 and lumped them with sampling distributions. I can see why they do that. 1, because Unit 4 was already huge, and 2, because when we're doing sampling distributions, we're usually using a continuous random variable like a normal distribution to do the calculations. So note that we've covered part of Unit 5 already if you finish Chapter 6. So now Chapter 7 is our traditional chapter on sampling distributions. There's a few things you'll need to add, and Daren mentioned this already, but in addition to the sampling distribution of a sample proportion, we also need you to pick up the subsection on the sampling distribution of a difference between 2 proportions, along with the corresponding exercises. So you can see the page number references there. That is for the content. And then once you've identified the content, it should be pretty easy to match up the exercises that go along with those. In parallel, section 7.3 is about the sampling distribution of a sample mean. So we also need you to pick up a small subsection from 10.2 about the sampling distribution of a difference between 2 means, along with the corresponding exercises. And again, we've given you the page number references right there on the slide. So some key terms to include as you're teaching this chapter: point estimator. That typically gets introduced, or we typically introduce that in chapter 8 when we're talking about a point estimate versus an interval estimate, but it does come up in unit 5, so make sure and mention that term. Also, they talk about a randomization distribution in contrast to a sampling distribution, so you want to make sure and understand the distinction there. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, there's a much bigger emphasis on the 10% condition. 4 different essential knowledge statements address this, about why we check the 10% condition and what happens to the standard deviation of the sampling distribution when that 10% condition is violated. There's also an important distinction between independent observations within a sample and independent samples when you have 2 or more samples. This is overall, there's a much bigger emphasis on the idea of independence, starting in this unit and then moving on through all the inference units. So it's important that you as a teacher, and of course your students, understand that there's different ways to talk about independence in different scenarios. Within a sample, we want observations to be independent, so knowing what one person said shouldn't tell us anything about what another person would say. And if we're doing a 2-sample situation, we need to make sure that those samples are independent, unless of course we're talking about paired data. So for the pacing, you need to add a couple of days. We think 1 day to do the sampling distribution for a difference in proportions, and 1 day to do the sampling distribution for a difference in means should be sufficient. So we're asking you to spend 9 days instead of 7 on this chapter, assuming you add those 2 subsections. And then when you're done with chapter 7 and those subsections, your students will be ready to take personal progress check number 5. All right, so now we're getting into the inference chapters, specifically the ones about proportions and means. And Daren already talked about this a little bit at the beginning, how in TPS 4, 5, and 6, we organize these chapters based on the organization of the previous course outline. And now that they're grouping things differently, that creates a little bit of a dilemma for people who are using TPS 4, 5, and 6. So you can see our advice at the top. Our advice is teach chapters 8, 9, and 10 in the order they come in the book, and then assign the progress checks as stated below. And so we'll zoom to the bottom for just a second. Because unit 6 is about proportions, you could finish that, give that personal progress check after section 10.1. And then because unit 7 is about means, you can give that personal progress check when you finish chapter 10. So the idea here, or our advice, is that when we developed chapters 8, 9, and 10, we did it very intentionally, building things in a very logical, sequential order that would make sense. That includes not only the narrative and the examples, but also the exercises. So exercises in chapter 10 assume you've done chapters 9 and 8 completely. So it'd be very difficult to try and rearrange all these subsections just to try and match the personal progress checks. So again, we encourage you to teach them in order and then just do the 2 progress checks towards the end of chapter 10. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to still spend some time talking about the details of chapters 8, 9, and 10. So chapter 8 in TPS 4, 5, and 6 is about estimating with confidence. That's an overview of confidence intervals in section 8.1. 8.2 is about confidence intervals for a population proportion, and 8.3 is about confidence intervals for a population mean. So in the course framework, they define a confidence interval as an interval estimate of plausible values for a parameter based on sample data. So that italicized phrase is there because when they talk about interpreting a confidence interval, they say that you should not only give details about the population, but also about the sample that it came from. There's an emphasis on confidence level and making sure students understand that. There's several essential knowledge statements dealing with confidence level, which should be the capture rate of those intervals when the conditions are met. Also, we've alluded to this already, but there are an increased emphasis on the conditions for inference, particularly about independence. So the way they present conditions in the new course framework, they first start by talking about sort of the two purposes for checking the conditions. One is that observations in a sample are independent, and two is that the sampling distribution is approximately normal when we're using a normal distribution. Later on, we could also talk about that a t-distribution is appropriate or a chi-square distribution is appropriate. So essentially, the first purpose is to verify independence within a sample, and the second is to make sure that you're using the correct sampling distribution. So those are the purposes. Now, when it gets down to checking to make sure that those things are valid, it's the same conditions as always. The random condition, the 10% condition, and then the large counts condition if you're dealing with proportions, or the normal large sample condition if you're dealing with means. So nothing's really changed about the way we check the conditions. It's just that there's sort of a broader framework that students need to be aware of and the reasons why we're checking those conditions. On the formula sheet, a nice bonus is that they now say it's statistic plus or minus critical value times standard error of statistic. And one nice thing about the formula sheet is it not only lists the standard deviations of the statistics, but the standard errors. And we know in almost every situation, it's the standard error that we actually use. So it's nice that those are finally provided on the formula sheet and that the generic formula for a confidence interval is about the standard error. There's a brief mention of using a confidence interval for a proportion to get a confidence interval for other parameters. If you remember the stealing soda question from a few years ago, I think part B of that question is what this is getting at. There's also a specific statement that students need to know that the margin of error is proportional to 1 over square root n. So not just being able to solve for sample size, but having that sort of conceptual understanding that is proportional to 1 over square root sample size. Now for pacing, like before, we suggest that you do chapters 8, 9, and 10 in order, and to spend the same number of days that you would have spent in the past. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Daren now for chapter 9.
Not to repeat this too often, but our advice is that you teach chapters 8, 9, and 10 in order. Don't try to shuffle things. It's not easy. And then assign the progress checks, as Josh mentioned before, when you get to chapter 10. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hypothesis testing aspect. In chapter 9, we give an overview of how students learn to test a claim. And you can see those same two purposes that Josh described earlier for confidence intervals are reappearing. And you can see that the same way of checking those conditions still applies. So there's nothing particularly new or different there other than the emphasis on independence of observations and the sampling distribution being of the right type. The formula sheet describes the standardized test statistic as statistic minus parameter over standard error of statistic, like Josh was describing earlier for confidence interval. But note that if you're doing a one proportion z-test, your null value is actually what you use to calculate the standard deviation of the statistic, assuming that value of p is correct. So we've chosen to kind of parenthetical it here to remind you that things are changing a little bit. Similar to what Josh was talking about on confidence level, when students are thinking about a p-value and trying to interpret it, they should think about it as the probability of getting evidence for the alternative hypothesis as strong or stronger than the observed evidence when HO is true. And there's a caveat, assuming the conditions are met and therefore that probability model that you think is correct, it really is correct. So in both cases, they really need to know that the conditions are met or this p-value is not accurate. Again, for pacing, we recommend that you stick with the advice in the teacher's edition for chapters 8, 9, and 10. So I'll wrap up this part of inference where we're looking at proportions and means by talking about chapter 10, which in TPS is where we compare two populations or treatments. So the conditions get a bit more complicated now. We mentioned earlier that in thinking about the purpose of independence, we think about independence of two samples from each other when we're sampling so that we can combine the variances. We also think about the independence of the individual observations within each sample. So that might be 10% condition when you're sampling without replacement. And second, we think about the sampling distribution of, say, x bar 1 minus x bar 2 or p hat 1 minus p hat 2 being approximately normal. Otherwise, our calculational methods won't be correct. Keep in mind that students often get confused about using a t-distribution when they're doing inference about means. One of the assumptions for using the t-distribution is that the sampling distribution of x bar 1 minus x bar 2 is approximately normal, or else it's not appropriate to use a t-distribution for your calculations. So in talking about the random condition, I just want to reiterate, in the sampling situation, we want independent random samples. In a randomized experiment, we want random assignment of subjects to treatments or treatments to subjects. The 10% condition, thinking about independence of observations, really just applies to sampling from a population. And when we're thinking about the check for the sampling distribution being approximately normal, there is a very specific instruction in the course framework that students should check the large counts condition for a hypothesis test of P1 minus P2 equals 0. In other words, that the two population or true proportions are equal, by using the pooled or combined proportion of successes, which we call P hat sub C for combined. That's been ambiguous in the past. Sometimes rubrics have shown checks using the sample proportions themselves, as we would do with confidence intervals. Sometimes they've shown it with the combined proportion, but the course framework has indicated that this is the preferred method. It's consistent with assuming that HO is true, so it's easy to make that argument. Also, Josh mentioned earlier the idea of a randomization distribution. This comes up again, especially when we're doing a difference of proportions or means when we're in a randomized experiment. You can think of simulating the random assignment many times under the assumption that the null hypothesis is true, and looking at what the distribution of the simulated distribution of the difference in proportions or means looks like. The good news is that can be modeled by the sampling distributions that we've already studied when the conditions are met. One other piece of advice, we are in the 21st century now, and so it didn't surprise me that the course framework really recommends using the degrees of freedom from technology when students are doing two sample T procedures. In the golden ages of the 2000 and before, we might have used the smaller of the two individual degrees of freedom, n-1, for the two samples, and taken the smaller one, but that seems to be fading into past memory now. So in terms of pacing, again, stick with the recommendations in the annotated teacher's edition. For the personal progress checks, we recommend the Unit 6 prepackaged personal progress check after section 10.1 and the Unit 7 prepackaged PPC after section 10.2, which is in 4th and 5th edition. For the 6th edition, it would be right after section 10.3. I'm going to turn it over to Josh to finish up the inference story.
All right, so here we are in Unit 8, which is inference for categorical data, chi-square. So you'll find that in Chapter 11 of both the 4th, 5th, and 6th edition, or all 3 editions. Really not a whole lot new here in this unit. They do specifically have an essential knowledge statement that says that the chi-square statistic measures how far the observed counts are from the expected counts relative to the expected counts. I keep mentioning that there are essential knowledge statements about these things. That's important to know because items are going to be classified and filterable by essential knowledge statement. So anything that is described in an essential knowledge statement is something that questions can be written towards. So these things, should be understood by students. The conditions for chi-square tests are the same as always. And like Daren and I said earlier, they have that initial two purposes, independence and correct sampling distribution. But the nitty-gritty of actually checking them is the same as you'll find in all 3 books. One thing to mention is to emphasize the p-value interpretation. That keeps coming up in each of these units. A separate learning learning objective about interpreting the p-value. So it seems like that's something that could have more emphasis on future exams. And you want to make sure students realize that they need to be able to interpret p-values, not just in chapter 9 when they learn them, but the first time, but also chapters 10, 11, and 12. The same thing would be true with interpreting confidence level, describing type 1 and type 2 errors, interpreting power. Just because we learn those in earlier chapters doesn't mean they don't apply still in later chapters. So as far as the pacing goes, we suggest 6 days for chapter 11, but if you'll note at the top, we've got some author advice, and that is, when you get to chapter 11, most of us are in a hurry, and maybe for snow days or tornado days or whatever it happens to be, you might be short on time. So one consideration, if you've already done 12.2 back in Unit 2, you might consider combining chapters 11 and section 12.1 for efficiency. In fact, there's kind of a nice connection there. The last thing we cover in chapter 11 is chi-square test for independence, where the null hypothesis is that there's no association between two categorical variables. And then in section 12.1, we do a test for an association between two quantitative variables. So it's kind of the same idea. Is there a relationship between these two variables in a population? It's just that chapter 11 deals with two categorical variables and chapter 12 deals with two quantitative variables. So it actually does make some sense to combine those two topics, not just for efficiency, but also to make some interesting connections. And then once you finish chapter 11, you can do personal progress check number 8. All right. The last unit is Unit 9 about inference for quantitative data and slopes. Again, this is section 12.1 in all 3 books. One note for users of the 6th edition, like I said earlier in Unit 2, in the 6th edition, we use the notation y hat equals b sub 0 plus b sub 1x for the regression line, in which case we had to use mu sub y equals beta sub 0 plus beta sub 1x. For the population line. Again, that's in the 6th edition. But in the new course framework, they gave us the simpler version of y hat equals a plus bx. So that is how we're going to describe the population regression line, mu sub y equals alpha plus beta x. For users of the 4th edition and the 5th edition, that's the same as what you have in the book. So no worries about that at all. One interesting thing that they added is that when checking the conditions for inference for slope, we use the LINER acronym, and N stands for normal, that the distribution of residuals is approximately normal at each x value. So that is still the right way to check that, but they're allowing a large sample override of that normality condition, that is N greater than or equal to 30. So for pacing, assuming that you've already moved section 12.2 back with chapter 3, we suggest 3 days for section 12.1, which is what you'd find in the teacher's edition currently. And of course, if you combine that with chapter 11, you may be able to save a little bit of time because you only have to prepare for 1 test in that case. So personal progress check number 9 can be done after section 12.1. So that is the nitty-gritty of all of those things. There's a couple more things we want to wrap up really quickly. There's a much bigger emphasis in this course and exam description on course skills. These are things that aren't content exactly, but they're skills that you'll learn as you're teaching the content, or actually your students will learn as they're learning the content. Skill 1, I'm just going to read the overall heading. Skill 1 is about selecting statistical methods. Select methods for collecting and or analyzing data for statistical inference. And you'll see on this slide, that's all the stuff before inference. Skill 2 is about data analysis, describing patterns, trends, associations, and relationships in data. Skill 3 is about using probability and simulation to explore random phenomena. And finally, skill 4 is about statistical argumentation. Develop an explanation or justify a conclusion using evidence from data definitions, or statistical inference. So I'll have you go to the next slide. There we go. Continues that skill matrix. You can still see this 4 skills across the top. The second page here is all the stuff that relates to inference. But I mostly want to talk about the things that are on the bottom of this slide. So these skill categories are assessed on both sections of the AP exam. And there's a really nice section of the course and exam description towards the end. I think it's called About the Exam or something like that, where they specifically define the multiple choice section in 2 ways. They define it by unit, and they'll say, oh, 12 to 15% of the questions will be on this unit and so on. But they also define it by skill, so that you'll know what percent of the multiple choice questions will be about skill 1, what percent will be about skill 2, 3, and 4. So when they're developing a set of 40 multiple choice questions, it's kind of like an overlapping grid where you've got content requirements and skill requirements to try and match those up and hit those percentages. So it's going to be a challenge for them, a little bit more, I think, than in the past, to create an exam that matches all those requirements. Also, the free response questions are specified by skill category. So if you look in that portion of the course and exam description, it'll say that one of the free response questions will be primarily about skill 1. One will be primarily about skill 2. Another one will be primarily about skill 3. There'll be another question that's a traditional inference question, what we'd call a 4-step question. The 5th question will be kind of a wild card that mixes and matches skills. And then, of course, question 6 is still the investigative task. And what's nice about that is it clearly defines what we've kind of already know, which is it's using the skills that you've learned in a new setting or in a non-routine way. So by focusing the free response questions on skill category rather than content, that gives you a good sense of how these questions are going to be laid out. So again, thinking about the test developers, I think they've got a little bit less freedom, a little bit more strictness on the kinds of questions they can write and the way they can create a form. And I think that's purposeful from the College Board to try and be more transparent about what kids can expect on the AP exam. So that's really important for you to know as a teacher, so that you can be given that confidence to your students as you're teaching the course. So the last bullet here is about the question bank and the personal progress checks. Those items are tagged by skill. So in addition to, you can search by essential knowledge statement or learning objective or topic or unit. You can also search for skill. And then the last thing I want to say about skills before I hand it back over to Daren, is that if you're teaching this course, if you're teaching using TPS and following along like we asked you to, and if you're teaching all the learning objectives and the essential knowledge statements in the the course framework, then you're teaching these skills. I don't think this is something where you need to say, oh, it's Tuesday, I have to cover skill 3 today. Really, these skills should be a byproduct of all the other good things that you're already doing. And so using the 4th edition, 5th edition, or 6th edition, you can be confident that your students are getting lots and lots of practice with these core skills. And you can see that on these slides with the stuff in the red font, all the different places that we cover these skills. All right, back to Daren.
Thanks, Josh. So in summary, you can see the order of the new course framework is different. We have those 9 units, but the practice of statistics, 4th edition, 5th edition, 6th edition includes the content and skills required for success on the new AP statistics exam. Josh alluded earlier to the We've Got You Covered site where we house really, really important resources. So I'm going to try to go to the site right now and go to AP statistics. Let me just scroll down here. So for each of the editions, 4th edition's down there, 5th edition, 6th edition, and there's something else over there on the left I'll mention in a moment. But you can see, for example, with the 5th edition, we have the big picture correlation or alignment guide that looks like what I popped up earlier. We have the correlation by unit, which is sort of the detailed slideshow that we've gone through just now. We have a video that sounds somewhat like this video, except just my voice. And then Josh has been mentioning these supplemental handouts. So I wanted you to get a chance to see how easy it was to pop those open, download them, and there they all are. So it really doesn't take very long to get them, grab them. There's the annotated AP statistics formula sheet that Josh talked about. And if I were a betting man, I would guess this would be a really good file to start with. A guide to the supplements handouts might be just the place to start before you dig in. So we do have you covered, whether you're using the 4th edition, 5th edition, or 6th edition. But I've got just one more slide, and then I'll kick it back over to Tommy. We obviously have been paying close attention to the course framework and the new course and exam description, and we realize that some people might prefer a version of the 6th edition that goes strictly in alignment with the new course framework. So we've been working hard on that, and we have come up with an updated version of the 6th edition. I'll just give you a little sneak peek of the alignment here. We've actually rewritten the inference portion, unit 6 and 7, so that now we have a chapter that's about estimating proportions with confidence, a chapter about testing claims about proportions, a chapter about estimating means with confidence, and a chapter about testing claims concerning means. So it matches perfectly with the course framework. You'll also notice chapter 12 does what Josh was suggesting earlier as a possibility for efficiency and blends the inference for categorical data chi-square and the inference for quantitative data slopes, both as forms of relationships between two variables and doing inference. So, it was a bit of a dilemma for us. We just adopted the 6th edition last year and have actually just made the decision to go to the updated edition 6E, just to make it a little bit easier for us to try out those personal progress checks as they're built next year. So we're pretty excited about it. But if that's something that you might be interested in, Tommy mentioned earlier your BFW rep is a great source of information about that. The preliminary edition of this, the preliminary version in paperback, will come out in July, and folks who choose to adopt the updated 6th edition then will get the full hardcover book in around January. So Josh and I better make sure we get that finished. Tommy, I think I'll kick it back over to you.
Excellent. Let me... All right, so you should all be seeing my Q&A screen now, hopefully. Again, as Daren just mentioned, a lot of great questions have been coming in through the chat, so thank you everyone for paying attention and being engaged and asking a lot of great questions. We will try to get through most of them if we can. However, we probably won't get through all of them. So if we don't get to a question you asked, or if you still have additional questions after the webinar, please feel free to email hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. We will also try to answer some of the questions in our follow-up email to this webinar. And of course, especially if it's a question about you're reordering materials, or you want to purchase materials, or you're not sure what books you're going to order next year or this year, contact your sales rep. If you're not sure who your sales rep is, you can email hsmarketing@bfwpub.com and we will get you set up. So a lot of great questions. I'm going to start from the top, Josh and Daren. We got some, so these ones were from earlier in the presentation, and then I'll try to work my way down. So Michael asks a pretty broad question. It might be actually more of a College Board question, but why the change?
So this is Josh. I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah.
And I think there was a couple motivations, and I'm putting words in the College Board's mouth. But they've been doing some courses have been fully redesigned with new content and big changes. And they've been using the understanding by design structure or framework, which includes big ideas and enduring understandings, learning objectives, and essential knowledge statements. And I think there was a desire to make sure that all courses were presented with that same framework. So I think that's a big part of why statistics is going through this process. I also think that the College Board in general is trying to be more transparent and more transparent with what courses are supposed to include and what the exam is going to cover. I know with my work on the SAT, I was there during the transition from the older SAT to the current SAT, and that was a big emphasis as well. So both SAT and AP, I think they wanted to avoid the perception that there's tricky questions or there are certain things that only people who are, quote, in the know would be able to expect. So they're trying to avoid those sorts of issues. So by releasing this course framework, which is many, many, many pages longer than the old topic outline, I think they're just trying to be very clear about expectations. So there should be no surprises for teachers or students.
Right, that's a great answer. Some of these other questions you and Daren actually may have answered already, but I'll just ask them again and you can quickly reiterate the answer. Cynthia asks, how necessary is it to still teach how to use a random number table? That was from earlier in the presentation.
So that's a great question. As a teacher, I think I still will. It's certainly possible that they could ask a question where they provide tables of random digits and expect students to be able to use them. We haven't seen a question like that for quite a while, but remember, we don't get to see all the questions. We don't get to see most of the multiple choice or some of the free response questions that are given on alternate exams and things like that. So my opinion as a teacher is I want to play it safe and make sure that my students have done a couple of exercises at least using a table of random digits.
Great.
Yeah. Can I jump in on that one, Tommy? I just want to echo agreement. I think if you're trying to write an exam problem where a student is going to carry out a simulation or carry out a random sampling process that they describe or carry out a random assignment process, and you want to see them actually carry it out, the rows of random digits are still the easiest way to accomplish that. It's not going to work to have kids doing some kind of random integer function on their calculators because we have no idea as exam readers what values they're going to be getting. So using the random digits table has the advantage of standardizing the answer, whether it's a multiple choice or a free response item.
Great. The next question comes from Tracy, who asked, is transformation to achieve linearity actually going to be on the exam now?
Well, it could be. There's a couple essential knowledge statements about it. It's not a guarantee, of course. There's only 40 questions they get to ask on multiple choice and 6 on free response. But that was one thing I looked for right away when I saw the new course framework is this still included? And so it still is. And so there'll be questions about it in the personal progress checks. And that could certainly mean there's questions about it on the AP exam. But one thing you do want to note, if you look through the course and exam description about the exam, you'll see that Unit 2 is relatively small percentage-wise as far as the coverage on the multiple choice exam. That doesn't tell us about the free response questions, but relatively small. So I would guess that there would be a question about that maybe every couple of years at most. The problem, of course, is we don't know which year that's going to be.
All right, a couple questions came in about pacing. Tracy also asked, is the pacing, when you were going over the pacing earlier in the presentation, is it based on year long or semester? I believe it's year long. Is that correct?
It is. And just to clarify, both Josh and I have similar weekly pacing in that we meet 4 times a week, not 5. So Josh has the advantage of starting his school year in August. We'll call that the advantage because it means that he gets almost an extra month ahead of my start around Labor Day. So we're sort of pacing it with that 110-day, i.e. 4-day a week with interruptions for special schedules and assemblies and tornadoes and weather events and other things. And so if you're in the luxurious situation of having a year-long course that meets 5 times per week, or in some kind of system that gives you more contact minutes than we have, that just gives you more chances to do activities, to incorporate a few more personal progress checks, some of those ones that are based on the individual topics, a few more formative assessments like quizzes, projects. I'd really love to have a few more days myself.
And are those, and what time frame are those pacings based on? For instance, 65-minute periods, or what length of class period was another question that kept coming in about pacing.
So in the ATE, Luke Wilcox, who wrote the ATE, paced it out over 110 class sessions, I think assuming 50-minute class sessions. That was tight. We tried to aim on a very tight schedule, knowing that it's easier for teachers to expand 110 days into more than to take a 180-day pacing calendar and condense it. So those are hopefully minimums. If you have more than 110 class sessions before the AP exam, then you can add, some days here and there, or you could include buffers for snow days and things.
College boards official pacing schedule that they include in the unit guide uses 140 days at 45-minute classes.
Great. Another question that came in that said, 5E gave us a recommended set of homework problems where there'll be new adjusted set of homework problems. And I think the answer to that would be with the updated edition.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the only suggestions we'd have for assignments would be to include the handouts that we've been talking about and that Daren showed you on the website, to include those exercises that are on the handouts, in addition to the homework assignments that were specified in the teacher's edition of either the 4th, 5th, or 6th edition. Those are basically the only things that really are new that weren't covered in those editions of TPS. Otherwise, the recommended assignment should be very good for covering all the content and skills.
Another question that came in, a couple people asked this, and we may or may not know the answer here. This might be another question for the College Board versus us, but the question was, are the personal progress checks something that we will be able to see ahead of time in relation, and it says parentheses, in relation to deciding whether to do chapter 4 first or not, worrying about cumulative questions, things like that. So basically, could they see the PPCs before the next academic year?
So this is Daren. That depends on what you mean by before. If like Josh, your school year starts on August, I don't know, 4th or 5th, Josh, sometimes it might be harder because they're only going to open the site for AP Classroom. They've promised it by August 1. So if you have an early August start or mid-August start, yes, you would have time to go in and take a look at those personal progress checks, but it might be tight for those of us that start later in August or in September, a little bit more time to preview them. But my understanding is that the AP Classroom site would open for us by August 1st.
And this is Josh adding on. So once it is open, you should be able to preview all of the personal progress checks, plus search through the question bank and consider what things you'd want to assign or not assign.
Michael asks, is there value in student summer pre-work for AP Stats considering the changes?
So this is Josh. Because I start early in August, I don't feel as much time pressure, so I don't have any summer work requirements, and I don't think that any of the sort of small new topics that are included would warrant any additional time that way or additional concern. So if you're currently not assigning any homework over the summer, then I don't think that these changes would affect your decision at all.
Great. And this question, I know you guys both answered, but it might be worth reiterating. The question is, so are you saying we should teach chapters 8, 9, and 10 as we have in the past?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just want to reiterate that one. Another question, this one is actually about TPS 5e. Does TPS 5e describe the difference between independence of samples and the independence of observations in each sample?
Yes.
Okay. Another question came in. And this one is actually, there's two of them about degrees of freedom. And I'm not sure, this was in the middle of the presentation, so it might not make sense, but it says, do you use degrees of freedom from technology? Also, we used to go by the smaller of the two samples for degrees of freedom. Do we still?
Yeah, I think I alluded to something about that, didn't I? You know, I took this course in the 1900s, and we definitely used, for two sample T procedures, we used the smaller of N1 - 1 and N2 - 1. But this being the 21st century, I think it's time to convert to use technology. It gives you a confidence interval that's narrower if you use the decimal degrees of freedom, and it gives you a p-value that's lower, and those are more correct values. So I'm going to argue for the technology. What about you, Josh?
I also agree. I happened to flip through my course and exam description, sitting right in front of me. And in topic 7.9, it does say in the essential knowledge statement that you can use a T distribution with degrees of freedom that can be found using technology. And the degrees of freedom fall between the smaller of N1 - 1 and N2 - 1, and so on. So I think there's enough of a reference to that you could probably still use that conservative method. I don't think that they would count that wrong on an AP exam, but my preference is, again, to use the technology, and then to talk about why. More degrees of freedom means smaller p-values, more power for a significance test, smaller margin of error for a confidence interval.
Great. We have a couple more questions, if that's okay. I think we can get through some good ones here for about the next 5 more minutes, and then we'll start to wrap up. So the next question is, the formulas on the new formula chart look great. The tables, however, seem to be spread over 2 pages, T and chi-square. Is that the case? It seems harder to use those tables than the older ones.
You know, I'm glad somebody noticed that besides me. I did ask the College Board for clarification on that point. I think it was a product of the choice of font and size that they made throughout the course framework. My understanding is that the tables won't change from what we are used to seeing, but they're going to put out a clarifying statement on that as soon as they're ready.
Great. And a couple more questions. The ideas of type 1, type 2, error, and power seem to have lost emphasis. Is this true in the new iteration of the course?
I don't think so. So they are mentioned, of course, in Unit 6. The first time we learn about significance tests, they talk about type 1 and type 2 errors and power. but I don't think they're diminished at all. I wouldn't say that, I think it would be a mistake, let me say it this way, to take like the percentage of EK statements or percentage of learning objectives about a particular topic divided by the total number of learning objectives and say that that's the amount of emphasis you should put on things. There's certain learning objectives that you could cover in 5 minutes, one class period, and be done for the whole year. But certainly the ones about type 1 and type 2 errors and things like that might only be 1 or 2 learning objectives, but those questions can continue to get asked all throughout the inference units. So I don't think there's any smaller emphasis on those topics.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. The next one actually is for you, Josh, again. It goes, I missed what Josh said, what to expect from the FRQs. I caught 6 hasn't changed, 5 is a wild card. What did he say about 1 through 4?
Good question. So this is all specified in the course and exam description way towards the end, right before the formula sheet and things. But essentially, there's no promise that it's going to be in this order. But one of the free response questions is primarily about skill 1. One will be primarily about skill 2. One will be primarily about skill 3. There'll be what we know as kind of our standard inference question, either a confidence interval or a significance test where you'd use the 4-step process. And then the 5th one would be a wild card that can mix skills. And then the 6th one is the investigative task. So one other point of clarification, on the free response question that I said is primarily about skill 1, say it's a 3-part question. That means 2 of the 3 parts would have to be about skill 1. The 3rd part could be a connection to inference or a connection to something else. Or it could be that all 3 parts are indeed testing that one particular skill. So I'd encourage you to read in depth on that about the AP exam part in the curriculum, the course and exam description.
Okay, again, I just want to reiterate to the folks that are still listening, there are actually a lot more questions, some of them really good and some really good complicated looking ones. So I just want to reiterate, if we didn't get to your question, please email hsmarketing@bfwpub.com and we will try to get reply to you as soon as we can there. Also, additionally, I will try to somehow collate all these questions and maybe provide all the answers in a single source so you can review later on. So we will be presenting this to you as best we can in our follow-up. While I go to the next slide, Josh and Daren, one question that did come in to kind of close it out was, why do we like flamingos so much? That was actually the final question.
I'm going to Daren take this one.
Flamingos are beautiful creatures. They're kind of interesting, and they kind of fly and kind of stand around, and we just think they're gorgeous.
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. We think they're cute and cuddly.
All right, so there you have it. So I will, again, please write down that HS marketing email and we can get your questions that did not get answered, especially if you have any questions about the updated Practice of Statistics 6th edition. You can email your sales rep too for specific questions on how to obtain this book. Or if you have any ordering questions, sales related questions, we can definitely check you out. Also, if you see that link on the very bottom there, statsmedic.com, not related to the TPS updated version, but they have a ton of great resources up there for statistics teachers, so be sure to check them out. In closing, stay tuned for that follow-up email with the webinar recording. Be sure to favorite and visit our BFW AP update site. If you have any questions for BFW, Daren and Josh, again, please email hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. For sales questions, especially those about the updated TPS 60, feel free to contact your sales rep. With that, thank you everyone for your time. I know it went fast, but it was a good amount of time. Have a great night, and we're here for you, and good luck.